다들인데 그지만은 팔매기 그거다 순전히 수밤 아니 담아 차리요래.
Today is the third or the last day of the teachings during this special Kajimunam.
사람기니 말람 팔마 소나게게 질르르게 신예.
I would like to, first of all, wish all my greetings to all of the teachers, tulkus, spiritual friends, and Sangha members listening over the internet, as well as to all of the faithful people who are listening over the internet, as well as all of my Tibetan friends and countrymen. So today we are speaking about the life and liberation of Atisha. And yesterday we spoke about how the person who invited Tibet was Lama Yeshe from Lama Kun. And so the Lama so it's Lama Yeshe and his nephew, Lama Yeshe Jangchu. Now, in terms of Tibetan history, Yeshe was a very influential figure. Of course, both he and his nephew had left great legacies for Tibet. But in particular, Yeshe had three great legacies for Tibet. And the first of these was spreading the teachings from Tu, as I mentioned. So I thought I would speak a bit today about how the teachings spread from Tibet, or Upper Tibet. So around 100 years had passed since Lagdharma had persecuted the teachings, basically 5 generations. And so during that time of 5 generations, Buddhism had weakened considerably. In particular, Yeshe, or the name he had before he became a monk, was Songye. And so the region where he lived was in Ngari, or at that time it was called Shangshung. This region of Shangshu or Ngari, so Ngari is a name that was given later. And it's because the Tibetan kings had gone there and established the areas, the 3 kingdoms of Ngari, that they was given the name Ngari. But before that, it's called Shangshung. So this areas before was really like the place where Bön religion had originated. And so even during the time of Yeshe, most of the people primarily had faith in the Bön religion. There wasn't too much interest in Buddhism. In addition, in many areas of Tibet, there were not a whole lot of people who even knew the Dharma well, because the Dharma had been persecuted. But there are many people who didn't really know the Dharma, but who explained it improperly. So there are quite a few people in Buddhism. Particularly the Tibetans really respected people who came from India very highly and often gave them a lot of gold. And so there are many kind of strange Panditas who came from India and would teach any sort of Dharma teaching. In particular, they would misunderstand, they would interpret the words of the Tantras literally and then misunderstand them. And so the situation in Dharma in Tibet became very chaotic. So for that reason, Songye, or Lama Yeshe, before he went to Tibet, even before he became a monk, he had read the words in the treatises himself and done a bit of investigation himself. And he realized that much of these people's behavior was kind of antithetical to the Dharma. And he tried to correct them by making various different laws and rules and guidelines, but they really didn't bring much benefit. And they were unable to really completely eliminate these faults. So for this reason, he thought it'd be very important to invite an authentic Pandita from India to come to Tibet and to reform Buddhism. So he thought this would be extremely important.
공기 실하게 동남천 받는 게 그래.
And he had a great interest in inviting a Pandita. Moreover, Yeshua himself gave up his royal power and went forth as a monk. And he spent most of his time trying to spread the teachings. He gave the kingship to his younger brother, though some histories say that it was his elder brother. And then he went forth, he had the monastic name of Yeshua, and then he built the Toding monastery in the region of Ngari. So this is the earliest monastery in Ngari that we have a history for. And it is still there and still in pretty good condition. And if there are in the future some people who might be able to go there, if they can go to Ngari Toding monastery and meet and see the monastery, I think that would be very good. So he founded the Toding monastery, and he invited many panditas from India. And among them was an India from eastern India named Dharmapala. And along with him, there were 3 disciples who also had the name Pala. And they spread the monastic vows in Ngari, and they established a community of the Sangha, and so they promoted the teachings of the Vinaya. And so this is what we call the Tu, or the upper Vinaya, or the upper transmission of the Vinaya. But in any case, when we speak about Langdharma persecuting Buddhism, this means that he singled out the monastic community and the monasteries and destroyed them. It doesn't mean that after the persecution that he completely eliminated Buddhism from Tibet. That's not what it means. So then when we speak about the beginning of the later transmission of Buddhism, and that primarily means when the transmissions of the vows, the monastic community, were reestablished in central Tibet. Now, the other day I spoke about the lower transmission. There's the upper and the lower transmission. So the upper transmission was a little bit earlier than the lower transmission from Gompo Rabsel. But in any case, there are the lineages of vows that came from Upper Tibet and from Lower Tibet to Lower Tibet. And it was after these 2 transmissions had been established in Central Tibet that the Tibetan Buddhism could be stably and widely restored on a large scale. And so this is what we call the later transmission of Buddhism. And then in addition to these 2 upper and lower transmissions, in the 13th century, there's a great Pandita named Shankara Sri from Kashmir. And the transmission of his lineage of the vows is called the Mahapandita tradition. And so basically in Tibet, all of the lineages of vows can be included in one of these 3, the upper, the lower, and the Mahapandita transmission. There's none that's not included in any of these 3. However, it seems the transition to the upper Vinaya, the lineage that comes from the 3 Palas, was probably broken. But here, one thing that we need to pay some attention to is that when we talk about the lineages of the vows, we're primarily talking about the lineage of the abbots. Because at that point, because not much attention is paid to the lineage held by the master of the ritual and the supplementary Sangha at that time, I think. For example, when Sakya Pandita took his picture vows, the abbot was Shankara Sri. But I believe that the master of the ritual and the other Sangha present were probably from the lower transmission. However, if you look in the Vinaya, the Bhikshu vow is received from the Sangha, It is not received from an individual. This is pretty clear. So it seems to me that in Tibet, we know the lineage of the abbot as the lineage of the vows. But we should really research this to see whether, in any case, it seems like it's like the name of the lineage of the vows is actually named for the lineage of the abbots. And this is something that we should investigate further. Now, the second of Yeshua's legacies was inviting Atisha, bringing him to Tibet. But the person who actually brought Atisha to Tibet was not Yeshua, that was Chanchukbar. And Yeshua was not actually able to meet Atisha in person. But the one who initially had the idea and who made the plan to invite him was Yeshua. And so for this reason, it's that, as most his Tibetan histories say, Yeshua, even if he had to sacrifice his life, or whether he didn't, in any case, without Yeshua, that you could say that Atisha would have been unable to come to Tibet. So if you wonder, well, how did Yeshua invite Atisha to Tibet? So first of all, had a Pantoin Rinchen Sangpo, the great translator who had previously gone to India to study and who was very famous in Tibetan history. And then he selected 5 or 6 intelligent young Tibetans. And he appointed Rinchen Sangpo as the leader of these intelligent young people, and they sent them to Kashmir. He sent them to the region of Kashmir to study. So Kashmir is what in Tibetan is called Kache, but these days we're going to talk about Kache in Tibetan. We understand it to mean people who practice Islam. But actually, that's not quite the right term. The reason why we call people who practice Islam for Kache, because when Muslims first came to Tibet, they came from Kashmir. When they said, where do you come from? They say, well, we come from Kashmir, or Kache. And so from then on, the Tibetans called them the name of Kashmiris, or Kache. But actually, their Islam is Islam. And so Kashmir is just the name of a place where they come from. It's the name of a region. It's not the name of the religion. In any case, he spent several young Tibetans to study in Kashmir and to learn how to translation. And after they had finished their studies, then Yeshua asked them to bring Panditas who could spread the Dharma and important scriptures back to Tibet. And so the king encouraged them to do this. And they did as he requested. They did bring a few Panditas from India. But these scholars were only learned in the texts that they had specifically studied, but they were not a level to reform Tibetan Buddhism fully and systematically. And even in terms of education and learning, they didn't have enough. And so Yeshua thought that this was Yeshua thought that these Panditas didn't really fulfill his wishes. Likewise, Yeshua had heard that there was a scholar named Atisha in India who was learned, venerable, and good. And when he heard this, then he had this idea that we absolutely had to invite this great pandita named Adisha. And so that, therefore, Yeshua gave the responsibility for bringing Adisha to someone named Gyatsundur Sengye, who was an older translator. And he sent Gyatsundur Sengye down to India. But the first meant to invent was unable to bring him, Gyatsundur Sengye was unable to bring Adisha to Tibet. And then not long after that, Yeshua had become quite old. And he passed away before his wish could be fulfilled. However, before he passed away, Yeshua told his nephew, Changchungpa, that he absolutely must bring Tibet. And so this was his last will and testament. And so, in order to fulfill his uncle's wish, Changchungpa sent Nakso Lhasa, so a translator also. He sent Nakso Lhasa to India to bring Adisha back. So Nakso went with a few helpers or assistants, and they all arrived in India. And when they arrived in India, Adisha was living at Vikramasila, and so they arrived at Vikramasila. So Vikramasila Monastery, maybe you already know, maybe some of you haven't heard it though. So this monastery was built in the 8th century by a king of the Pala dynasty. It was built by Dharmapala, or in Tibetan, say Padan Chuchyang. So it's said that it was built by this king, Dharmapala. And this monastic university was like the second most important monastic university after Nalanda. And in particular, it was like a hub for the center of Vajrayana Dharma, and in particular, the study of the unexcelled Tantra. And so those scholars the best of the scholars who graduated from that monastic university were given the title of Pandita by the king. And so for that reason, many great scholars came from that temple. I'd like them to give some that we might know. There's Naropa, whom we all know, right? So Naropa was a graduate a scholar who came from the Vikramasila. Likewise, there's Shantipa, the mind-only scholar. Indeed, Naropa and Shantipa are among the 6 scholars called the 6 gatekeepers. And these are primarily were the scholars who stayed by the 4 gates to Vikramasila, the 4 gates in the 4 directions and the 2 pillars, because many non-Buddhists would come to debate them at the monastery. And Adisha himself was also master at the Vikramasila. There was also Shakya Shribhadra, who later went to Tibet. Shakya Shribhadra also studied at Vikramasila. Then in 1203, Vikramasila was destroyed by Muslim invaders. Now, the ruins are still there. If you travel down from Siliguri, they are there along the way. In any case, Nakso and his party arrived at Vikramasila, and at that time, Gyatsundur the Sengye, the monk who had been previously sent to ask Adisha to come to Tibet, was there studying. And so Gyatsundur Sengye was the one who had initially invited Adisha, and he was very intimately familiar with the reasons why. And he gave them some advice. He said, don't pretend that you're here to invite him. Don't tell anyone that you are here to invite him. Just pretend that you're here to study. and then just stay here for a while. And then when the time comes, and if there's an opportunity, I can tell you how you should invite Atisha. So Naksul Lotsawa and his friends did as Gyatso Senge suggested. And they said, oh, we're here to study. And they spent a year studying there. And it was only a year later that they finally had the opportunity to explain to Atisha and explain how they had come to invite him to Tibet. But basically, for an entire year, they basically didn't have an opportunity to speak to that, because they had to say it directly to Atisha. They couldn't go through anyone else. No one else could know. But because Atisha was such a had such broad activity that it was probably hard for them to get an opportunity to speak to Atisha in private. But after Nakso had explained the situation in detail, then Atisha said, if I look at the way you tell the story, that Tibetan king must be a real bodhisattva. So if I were to go against a bodhisattva's command, that wouldn't be right at all. So now the Tibetans are teaching in Tibet, and you've come here so much hardship. So I'll definitely figure out a way to go to Tibet. And so they basically got this sort of a promise from him. Then George, as I mentioned the other day, whenever he had a question or a doubt, he would ask his special deity Tara about the issue. And she would directly tell him what to do. And as I mentioned yesterday, right? And so George asked his special deity Tara about this issue of going to Tibet. What Tara said at that time was, it'd be really beneficial if you go to Tibet. In particular, there'd be one upasaka or layperson who would be really beneficial for. And so this is what Tara said. If you ask who that layperson is, it probably means Dromtumpa. There's no one else. The main layperson he taught was Dromtumpa, right? Not only that, Atisha thought it was really important to go to Tibet, and so he went to Bodh Gaya. It was probably down by went to the great Buddha statue there, and he thought he ought to go and make offerings and make supplication at the same time. And at that time, there was a Khenpo there who was named Khenpo, or the abbot Jnanashri Mitra. And so this abbot named Jnanashri Mitra gave him a handful of cowrie shells. Now, cowrie shells means, so these are the shells of a sea-dwelling animal. It's kind of round, little shell. When I was little, the kids would tie them on our backs and carry them. And so he gave him a handful of cowrie shells and said, there's an old pale person with dreadlocks. He said really long dreadlocks, and so you should give these cowrie shells to him. So Atisha went to Bodh Gaya, and when he was going to make his offerings, then he met that old man that he's mentioned here. And the moment that he met that old man, then the old man said, give me the cowrie shells you brought for me. And before Atisha had anything to say, the old man said, give me those cowrie shells. And when he said that, Atisha realized this old person is no ordinary person. He's some sort of a dhaka or a document. And so he didn't actually prostrate, but in his mind, he prostrated. He said to her, I'm going to Tibet, and if I go to Tibet, will it be beneficial or not? This is what he asked, and the old man said, it'd be good for you to go, and it'll be very beneficial. She said exactly, or this old man said exactly as Tara had said. And then Tara asked me again, if I go to Tibet, will it have any obstacles to my life or not? Because at that time, the reason why I asked this, there are probably several reasons. For one reason is that at that time, Atisha was already in his 50s. He was already pretty old. And the second that Tibet is a very high area and a very remote place. And so, of course, there's a danger that he went there, there'd be some danger to his life. So he asked if would there be any danger to his life. And the Dakha said, if you go to Tibet, your life will be shorter. So if it's going to be shorter, how much shorter will it be? And the reply was, if you don't go to Tibet, you will live to 92. But if you go to Tibet, you won't live longer than 73. So in actuality, if you go to Tibet, your life will be 20 years shorter. And so at that time, Atisha thought to himself, if it's beneficial to Tibet, it doesn't matter whether my life is shorter or not. In any case, he decided to go to Tibet. But if the director said, I'm going to Tibet, then the king of the Indian king and the monastery authorities and the sponsors wouldn't have allowed him to go. And so Atisha was had a little bit of a skillful way to say it. He said, I'm going on a pilgrimage. And so he took Natso Lotso and all the different people, and he did the various different places. They went here, over here, and there. It's kind of trying to fool them. I'm going on this pilgrimage. He said they went to all these different sites. And in the very end, where they went is they went to Nepal. Because if you're going to go to Tibet, you have to go via Nepal, right? So after they went through all sorts of different sites, they got to Nepal. Now, at that time, there was one of the elders, one of the worker and authority of Vikramasila Monastery. And so at this time, he felt a little bit uneasy about that. He's just going on a pilgrimage, working at this, taking all these Tibetans and having no idea where he's going to go. So he got suspicious. And when he felt suspicious and he felt uneasy about it, he insisted that he had to go with Atisha. And wherever Atisha went, then he just went along with him. And when they arrived in Nepal, he learned of Atisha's plan to go to Tibet. And when he learned of it, then he immediately called Nakso Lotso and he said, you didn't come to do study. You say you originally told me that you're coming to study, but you didn't come to study. You came to kidnap him. It's not that we don't want to let Tibetan Atisha go to Tibet at all, but if we lose him to Tibet, there's the danger of Buddhism being destroyed in India. There's a danger of the teachings declining in India, so that's why we won't tell him. But in any case, Nakso Lotso and the elder spoke for a long time, and finally decided that Atisha would spend no more than 3 years in Tibet, and then after 3 years, Nakso Lotso would have to bring him back to India. And Nakso made a really strong oath and swear, and he said, I definitely will bring him back. And he made this promise, an oath, and only then were they just barely allowed to bring Atisha to Tibet. So when we think about this, when Atisha was going from India to Tibet, if it's that difficult, I wonder what the reason why the Indians didn't want Atisha to go to Tibet. Think about it, just the factual nature of things. When Nakso and his party came to bring Atisha to Tibet, Atisha was already in his 50s. And if you think about the life expectancy at the time, Atisha was already very old. In addition to that, Atisha was already a person, was basically already, if you talk about today's, he was not just any, he was also like at a national level. That's a kind of level of Pandita that he was very famous and he was very influential. And so for that reason, he had been appointed the abbot of the important and famous Buddhist monasteries of Vikramashila and Udantapura. And he was also the head or the master of several important temples in these areas of central India. And so for this reason, he normally had a key ring that always had a minimum of 18 keys on his belt. He had a lot of keys to carry, because they'd give him the keys to all the monasteries. This is your key, this is your key. And he had to, and he carried them all on his belt, and he took it. He's always going with these 18 keys on his ring, they're clanking together. And so this is why the Indians are so reluctant to let him go to Tibet. So one of the reasons why is that Indians didn't look at Tibet, and they thought it was like this land of darkness. It's like this remote and backwards place. And if he goes off to some remote and backwards place, they thought of it. From another perspective, at that time in India, the Buddhism was actually had begun to decline. And likewise, the traditions of the unexcelled tantric teachings were spreading very widely. And because of that opportunity, then the Hindu and the Buddhist religions began to mix. And there are many practices that occurred where you couldn't tell if they were Hindu or Buddhist. There were even many Buddhist Panditas who said that there's no difference between Buddhism and Hinduism and Buddhism. I don't remember the names of the statements, but he basically said that there's no difference between Hinduism and Buddhism. There was a scholar who said this. Atisha himself also said that these days in India, there are only 3 or 4 Panditas, including Shantapa, who can tell Hinduism and Buddhism apart. Now, Atisha included himself in that. If it's only 3 or 4 Panditas who can tell Hinduism and Buddhism apart, the teachings of unexcelled Tantra had spread, and the Hindu and Buddhist practices began to really mix, and it's really hard to tell what was it. It's very difficult to tell who was what was which. So for this reason, it's really important for Indian Buddhism that Atisha could stay in India. So one example of how important Indians considered Atisha, at the Vikramashila temple, there was one wall, and on the right side there was a painting of Nagarjuna, and on the left was Atisha. It's basically saying that they considered him equal to Nagarjuna. Likewise, also in Vikramashila monastery, on one other mural, they had a mural of all the Panditas, and on the other side they had a mural of all the Mahasiddhas. And Atisha was painted in the line of Panditas and in the line of Mahapandita, in the line of Siddhas. And so he was included. So Atisha was included in both the line of Panditas and the line of Mahasiddhas, who are incredibly important. In addition to that, Atisha had such a gentle character. He was someone who got along with everyone. He had a very open mind. And so because he had such an open mind, that at that time, he was familiar with all the positions and had experience with all the positions of the various Buddhist schools in India of that time. And so for that reason, all the different schools respected him and they all loved him. And we can look at this, and we can see this in the praise of Atisha written by Naksul Laksawa. It says, Adantapuri, there were 350 monastics, and in Vikramashila, just about 100. Of all they were all from all the schools. You had no arrogance about the schools. You became the crown jewel of all the forest communities of the teacher in all the sacred sites in the land of Magadha. You sit at the head of all the 18 schools, and everyone accepts you. So there are like 350 at Adantapuri, then there are around 100 in Vikramashila. And among them, there are Sangha members from all the 4 schools. And so he was from the Mahasangika, and so he didn't have any pride of being from the Mahasangha school. He paid respect to all of them. And also in the likewise, and at the various sacred sites in the land of central Tibet and Magadha, there are the 4 communities, the bhikshus, the male and female lay pastors, and they all respected them all. And so they listen to everyone who they say. They all respect you, and they all listen to everything you say. Likewise, there are also great debates between the middle only and the mind, the middle way and the mind only in India. But Atisha would take the good parts of the middle way view and the mind only conduct, practiced them in union. And so he was able to practice both the lineage of the profound view and the lineage of vast conflict without any conflict. In any case, Atisha was really important in India. And so the Indians were extremely reluctant to let him just go off to Tibet. But in any case, Atisha and his party went to Nepal, and they probably spent one year there. But what's unfortunate is that on the way to Nepal, then Gyatso Tsendu, the elder translator, passed away. And when he died, then Atisha said, "Now the translator has died. It's like I no longer have a tongue." In the old days, because if you don't have it in the old days, if you have a translator, it's the same as not having a tongue. So he thought there's no point to going to Tibet. What Nakto said is, "Oh, you shouldn't say like that. There is a really well-known translator, Rinchen Sangpo, in Tibet, and he can serve you. And if you for ordinary conversation, then I can help on that. I can translate those, but you absolutely must continue on to Tibet." And he was really insistent. Because of his request, then Atisha continued on his way to Tibet. And in 1040, when Atisha was 59 years old, he arrived in the region of Ngadi. So what I'd like to speak about next is about how they welcomed Atisha when he arrived in Ngadi. So at that time, the king was Changtu. So he was in the royal family, but he had become ordained, and his monastic name was Changtu. So I think this was probably when he had already gone forth. In any case, Changtu had been waiting a long time for Atisha's arrival. And so they prepared the welcome well before he arrived. And so they were at the Toding Monastery, as I mentioned before, the monastery that was founded by Yeshe. So it had been enlarged a bit during the time of Changtu. And when Atisha was getting close to the monastery, they had a really elaborate welcome. They had 300 lay people were riding white horses, and then they're all carrying it on their hands, all banners and pennants and various offerings, and they had a huge welcome. And in particular at that time, for Atisha to arrive was something that all the gods and humans should really rejoice about. they thought they have to do something that's really elaborate, really impressive. And so Chanchu himself thought to himself that we have to make a musical instrument that is really loud and really impressive. So we have the raktung that we play and the horns that we play. Sometimes we call it dongchen, sometimes we call it raktung, sometimes we call it dongmar. But that's when this was invented. And so for that reason, we also call the raktung the horn for inviting translators and scholars. So at that time, it said that there had never been any raktung before. There's something so loud to that. But Chanchu said, we need something really loud. And he made this raktung. And when Atisha came, they played the raktung. And when they played the raktung, what happened is all the live animals and the livestock in Tibet had never heard anything. So if you know how to play the raktung, it can be very powerful. A very powerful and strong sound. And so all the animals on the hill fled, and all the animals and all the horses they were riding were panicked and fled. So at that time, I think that is like this kind of like a really unthinking and obstinate must have played the doctrine. So it's such a huge volume that it probably frightened Atisha and all those mild mannered Indians, but they'd come to, I don't know whether this welcome pleased Atisha, or if he found out that because he'd probably never heard something so loud in his life. And all the animals and the horses are fronting away. He's wondering what's going on. So Atisha was such a mild mannered, and they probably scared him. So Atisha arrived in Toding Monastery, and after he arrived, Chanchu explained the whole situation of Tibetan Buddhism. He explained how the Dharma Kings had established the Dharma in Tibet, how Long Dharma had persecuted the teachings, and then how his predecessor, disregarding his own life, had worked to reestablish the teachings. But there are so many false teachers of the Dharma that all the teachings have become mixed up, and it's a very chaotic situation of the teachings. And as he explained this, he was shedding tears as he said this, and he's had a really strong feeling as he explained what had happened. And in the end, what he said is, so Chanchu said, you've come to Tibet now, and now that you've come here, so please, you don't need to teach at all those really profound and really amazing Dharma teachings. Just teach the Dharma, and just teach the Dharma of cause and effect. Sometimes people say various different things. You don't need to talk about the profound and amazing teachings, because this time the other false teachers had taught about like miraculous teachings and profound teachings and called it secret mantras. You don't need to teach it. He said, just teach about karmic cause and effect. And so Atisha was really pleased to hear this. And so among all the profound dharmas, karmic cause and effect is even more profound than that. So even seeing the Yidam deity's face is not important. If you have a stable conviction in karmic cause and effect, then that is better than seeing the face of the India. In India, there is a yogi who practiced Yamataka. And he saw his own deity's face. He saw that he'd seen Yamataka, and he thought it was because if I make a few mistakes, it's not going to be a big deal. And he started using the common things of the song in any which way he desired. So because of this, he was later reborn as a hungry ghost. And the Yadaki was born to was in the same shape of the Yamataka that he'd been meditating on before. So that's the kind of hungry ghost he was reborn of. And so Atisha told many other such stories. And he did as Chanchu had supplied. And he taught a lot about karmic cause and effect. For that reason, the people in Tibet called him Guru Karmic Cause and Effect, because he only taught karmic cause and effect. They talked about the Guru Karmic Cause and Effect. But even that very name was actually really beneficial to Buddhism, because karmic cause and effect is really important. Because in the profound things, the miraculous things are not so important. But it's important for everyone to understand how important the karmic cause and effect, and calling him by that name helped people understand. So at that time at Pudding Monastery, Rinchen Sangpo, the translator Rinchen Sangpo, was there. He probably thought, I'm probably not going to get much of it. Trouble would ask him so much, and later I'll see. And so, but later he understood what a great Lama he was. A great Lama and followed Atisha's guru. Not only himself, he encouraged everyone else. Atisha has 1 year to stay in Tibet, so you go take all the teachings you can. He encouraged everyone. Because of this, then also the Venerable Hansen Chandru then offered a lot of gold to Atisha and said, here in this land of Tibet, there are a lot of individuals with misconceptions about Buddhism who explain it incorrectly. They've never met authentic spiritual teachers. So a lot of such people, and they pretend to know things that they don't know, and they make a lot of falsehoods. And they're doing various other things, and even among them there are many disagreements, and they really dispute with each other. They're always just in conflict with each other, and so for this reason, so there's so many teachings of false dharma and false secret mantra. So in order to eliminate this, please teach the dharma. Please dispel their doubts. Moreover, he asked 2 questions about the common vehicles, 2 about the paramitas, and 3 about the Vajrayana. He asked 7 questions. And then he asked Atisha to write a treatise that summarized the entire teachings of Buddhism in a few words. Related to the Guru's own practice that explained his own experience. Likewise, there are also pith instructions on the Guhya Samaja Tantra by Bodhinyana that so write a sadhana based on these with Avalokiteshvara, the main deity of the mantra. So please write this. Please write this sadhana, he asked. And so what Atisha said is that Nagarjuna's string of jewels, the Rinchen Tengwa, is already in Tibet. And there's no Tibetan that's better than that, so that's enough, isn't it? There's nothing better than that, he said. If you say you want a sadhana of Guhya, there's the Kunsanga, the Samantabhadasana. But then later he wrote the Lamp for the Path of Enlightenment. So that there are 2 requests made from the first of them, and in order to fulfill the first of these, he wrote the Lamp for the Path of Enlightenment. And for the second, he probably either wrote or translated a Guhya Samaja sadhana. The Lamp for the Path is very well known, as you all know. But this is the length of the text is 67 stanzas. So it encompasses in its longer stages of the path, the great path. It has really 3 features. The 3 main features, first of all, that it summarizes the points of both Sutra and Tantra. And so the topic is complete. And it primarily teaches how to train your mind and how to tame your mind. And so for that reason, it is easier for people to put into practice. Also, the advice that it is ordained with, or that is adorned with, are by 2 gurus who are learned in the two traditions. So this means Rinpoche Kujuk, who was learned in Nagarjuna's tradition, and Suvarnadvipa, who was learned in Asanga's. And because this text is sort of adorned or embellished with the instructions that Atisha had received directly for them, and so because it combines both, it's better than one that is solely in the vast view, conduct, lineage of the vast deep view, and the lineage of vast conduct combines all the time. So it had many different features, including the advice given in this tract is so great. You realize all the teachings are not in conflict, and contains all the description. You can receive Buddha easily. So it is said that because of Atisha writing this text, it was no longer necessary to directly or forcefully block the false dharma and false mantra. You didn't have to actually tell people you should not do this. It's like you shouldn't have to make any violent or forceful ways to it. It just naturally stopped on its own. And so for this reason, it's because of writing the Lamp for the Path of Enlightenment had a very strong influence on Tibet. But even if Atisha had written that text, but if there hadn't been someone like Ajahn Trungpa, and who would then later spread the text or teach the text, then what would have happened is it would be like the Kamalashila stages of meditation. There, the first, second, and the third. It would have become like that because Kamalashila stages of meditation are something that are studied a little bit in the philosophical schools, but they're not something that anyone had practiced. Actually, the stages of meditation are texts that teach meditation to be practiced, but later no one ever really practiced them. It's basically in the philosophical in the philosophical schools at the monastery. They say, "Oh, this is what it says," but there's no actual practice. But because of Geshe Trungpa, he first meditated on it. He developed its meaning and realized its meaning. And because of his meditation, his practice, he was able to practice the real and undiminished teachings of the Lamp for the Path. Is the fact that they're still here is because of Ajahn Trungpa's kindness. So one person asked Ajahn Trungpa, I said, wouldn't it be good to have a commentary on the Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment? It'd be nice to have one. And when he was asked them, Trungpa said this. He said something pretty amazing. He said, there's no commentary on the words. You don't need a commentary on the words, he said. I'm a student who received the Lamp for the Path of Enlightenment directly from its author. So I'm the commentary. I'm the actual commentary on the meaning. Look at how I act. So it's like, I'm the living lamp for the path of enlightenment. So this is a really impressive thing. You don't need a commentary. What good is it going to do to read the words? I'm the actual commentary, he said. So in brief, so that is about the story of the Lamp for the Path of Enlightenment. But when we're speaking about the Lamp for the Path, we're talking about the 7 questions. There's a Zhou's life story, The Path of Liberation. And there it says that Chantra wrote 7 questions and posed the 7 questions. And Atisha wrote the Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment as a response to the 7 questions. But that life story does not clearly identify what the 7 questions are. Then when Atisha went to central Tibet, there's Kutan Tapayundran, Lodin Shirap, and others also asked him. They asked 5 questions, and one of them was if means and prajnas are divorced from each other, can you achieve Buddhahood? Can you achieve Buddhahood through either means alone or through prajna alone? And when he was asked, when they asked Atisha, they said, asked these questions, then Atisha said, Atisha asked most of those questions before when I was up in Tibet, and I've written the answers in the Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. So it's probably clear that in the questions that Kutan and Ngok asked, they're probably the 2 questions on paramitas and the 3 on Tantra are clearly there. But it's not clear there what the 2 questions on the common path are. There's a commentary on the Lamp for the Path of Enlightenment by Panchen Lobsang Chögyam. And what it says in there is that there's a commentary by Nakso called the Ornament of the Explanations. And this presents each of these 7 different questions. Each of the 7 questions is given. Said, I have read a few old commentaries by the Kadampa masters, and they mention 5 or 6 of them. They say that they give 5 or 6 of the questions by Changchub. And they also clearly say how the answers relate to the questions. They say that the answer, that these words in the text, so from this stanza to that stanza are the answer to this question, from this stanza to that stanza, the second question, and so forth. But these days, there's not much of a custom of teaching the Lamp for the Path of Enlightenment in such a way. But Panchen Lobsang Chögyam says in his commentary, the explanations of the text are very detailed, and the ways beginners should practice are excellent. Because when you ask in terms of question and answer, then you have a really profound understanding of the person. It's really beneficial for beginners to put it into practice. So if you're able to teach the Lamp for the Path of Enlightenment according to this method of question and answer, it's a real particular benefit. Question, then there's a question of whether it's an auto-commentary on the lamp or not, and the stories about Atisha's travels to central Tibet, and though I'd like to speak about them, but there's not enough time to tell them today. So later, if I have the chance, I will relate them. So I think that this is basically enough for our teaching today for this special Munlam, and we don't really have time to go through much more than that. So there's no way I can say more than that today.